When people think of the Middle Ages, they often think of harsh and brutal kingdoms fighting over religion, land, and scarce resources. Though the Europe of the Middle Ages was at times very dark, there are forgotten chapters of medieval history which showcase some of the most vibrant societies anywhere in the world. One of these was the golden age of the Emirate of Córdoba on the Iberian Peninsula. For hundreds of years, medieval Spain, or Al-Andalus, as it was called by its Muslim Arab occupants, was one of the most prosperous and peaceful areas of the world. It was a place where Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived alongside each other without constant strife and turmoil, and where shared cultural exchange provided some of the most beautiful art, poetry, and architecture of the Middle Ages. At this time, the Iberian Peninsula had been under the rule of the Muslim Emirs originating from the Umayyad Caliphate, the largest Islamic realm in history. In the 7th century, Islam had expanded from controlling a few cities in Arabia to conquering lands all the way from the Atlantic coast in the west to the borders of India and China in the east. This change had taken place very quickly as the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid Empire reeled at the advance of the Arab armies. The Franks, led by Charles Martel, were the only reason why the advance of the Umayyad Caliphate did not push deep into Western Europe. This magnificent general and grandfather of Charlemagne had won a decisive victory over the Arab armies in the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, and contained the spread of Islam to the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal. Islam would come to thrive in Al-Andalus and flourish in the centuries to come. The Umayyad family, though challenged from within and outside their borders, came to rule what would become known as the Umayyad Caliphate, a term which represents the united people of Islam led by the successor of the Prophet Muhammad. Although the Umayyads, over the rule of about 10 caliphs, had constructed the largest Islamic empire ever, they were at odds with other would-be successors of the Prophet Muhammad. Succession in Islam had mostly been reserved for people who were of direct relation to Muhammad's family and considered of his direct descendants. The Umayyads were, in fact, not of the Prophet's family, and concentrated their influence in Syria from the city of Damascus, rather than from Mecca in Arabia. The contention between other factions for rule of the Islamic people led to frequent rebellions across the Caliphate. These happened often, but it was the coming of the Abbasids that launched a disastrous end for the Umayyad family. Abd Al Rahman I was a prince of the Umayyad family born in 731 AD, 1 year before the end of the Islamic advance into Western Europe after their defeat by Charles Martel. Abd al Rahman had been brought up in a palace north of Damascus. He was the son of an Umayyad prince and a Berber consort taken from the lands far to the west of the Caliphate in modern-day Morocco. The Berbers were a people from this area and were among the newer Islamic converts in the empire. Yet in Damascus, Berber women were not prominent except in the harems of the Umayyad nobility, who brought them back as trophies of war. As the grandson of the Caliph, Abd al Rahman lived as a royal until he was 20 years old. Owing to the perception of illegitimacy, impiety, and corruption, many subjects of the Umayyad dynasty had grown discontent with their ruling family. The incoming Abbasid dynasty saw this as an advantage and used it to stir the rebellions which toppled the regime in the year 750 AD. They brutally hunted and murdered the royal family of the Umayyads to solidify their own claims to power and remove the threat of a successor from the old dynasty. In the midst of these dangers, Abd Al Rahman fled with some of his family to the east. His escape was often interrupted by would-be assassins from the Abbasid ranks. In one dramatic scene, Abd Al Rahman was fleeing on foot with his brother from Abbasid horsemen near the river Euphrates. They reached the river bank and began to swim across, but Abd's brother was unable to swim the full distance. Exhausted and beginning to drown, he was convinced to turn back by the soldiers despite his brother's pleas from the other side. Abd's brother washed up on the bank and was immediately decapitated by the horsemen. In terror, Abd al Rahman took off from the other side and ran until he collapsed of exhaustion. Alongside several family members and servants, Abd al Rahman made his way into Egypt and did his best to hide away from those searching for leftover Umayyad royals. The new capital and focus of attention in the Caliphate was set by the Abbasids in the city of Baghdad, east of Abd al Rahman in Egypt. Though at times able to disguise himself and his purposes, Abd al Rahman was never able to live fully at peace and began a long retreat from Egypt across North Africa. Gradually moving further west as his cleverness and ingenuity allowed, he escaped most threats and arrived safely among his own people, the Berbers, of whom his mother had been taken years before. Owing to this lineage, he was treated graciously and found members of the Nazfa tribe, the same from which his mother had belonged to. Abd al Rahman's survival of the Abbasid assassins was impressive, but his potential to rise to power was still unlikely at this point. There were some signs, however, of coming glory for the young prince. A cryptic message had been given from a holy man during his westward retreat, suggesting that a man by his name would establish a new Umayyad bastion in the lands of Al-Andalus. At this time, Al-Andalus, modern Spain and Portugal, was ruled by the former Umayyad governor Yousef al-Fihri, and was a backward and chaotic corner of the new Abbasid dynasty. The Muslim forces had taken these lands from a Germanic people called the Visigoths. These peoples had been mostly Arian Christians at first, but were eventually joined to the Roman Catholic Church. They had come to power through a barbarous raid of the old Western Roman Empire, including sacking Rome itself. Though they came to distance themselves from their barbarian beginnings in other ways, the power often shifted very violently in their kingdom over the 300 years of rule from 415 to 711 AD. This destabilization led to the effective military campaigns which established the Umayyad Caliphate in Western Europe. A lasting legacy of Visigothic rule meant that although Al-Andalus was under Muslim control when Abd al Rahman arrived in 756 AD, its population remained predominantly Christian and Jewish. Once in Spain, Abd al Rahman took advantage of rivalries between the Qays and Yemen Arab clans vying for control of the region. His use of mercenaries and quick thinking allowed him to take Córdoba, ousting the previous emir after a battle outside the city. Over the coming years, the small kingdoms of the region fell under Córdoba's control. Abd al Rahman set himself up as the first ruler of a new line, maintaining his Umayyad lineage. Córdoba became a rich cultural and religious hub. It was known to have Jews and Christians in high government positions, a paradigm which was unprecedented for the time. Officials and ministers of the Umayyad family from Damascus immediately began to make their way into Al-Andalus to begin working and helping to rebuild the administrative system of the former dynasty. This new society in Al-Andalus would persist in some way until the end of the Reconquista in 1492. While the failure and extinction of Al-Andalus has made it less appealing to scholarship, it is no less significant as one of the greatest examples of religious tolerance in medieval Europe. Al-Andalus was formed in the year 711 AD at the advance of the Umayyads into Christian Iberia. A few decades later, Abd Al Rahman's subjects still consisted of these Christian families and their descendants. The Muslim Arabs and Berbers were not often united, and the political struggles were just as often between Muslim factions as well as between Muslims and non-Muslims. Al-Andalus was home to some of the most significant examples of Christian and Jewish toleration in any Muslim realm in history. Part of the great mosque of Córdoba was even reserved to Christians as a worship space, and many Jews retreated with the Muslims when the Catholics took the remaining kingdom of Granada in 1492, preferring Muslim rule to Catholic rule. This tolerance was partially demographic, but also philosophical, as Andalusian Islam followed the Maliki school within Sunni Islam. Andalusians, whether Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, helped make their country a center of science, medicine, astronomy, literature, art, and architecture. Many monuments from this period remain some of the most beautiful tourist destinations in Spain to this day. Córdoba of the Emirate and later Caliphate rivaled Constantinople and Baghdad as one of the greatest cities in the world, completed with lush gardens, paved roads, public baths, street lighting, hospitals, and libraries. Scholars in the Andalusian government preserved Greek, Roman, Persian, and Indian knowledge by translating these texts into Arabic, which enabled later translations by Europeans into Latin. These works included histories, medical and scientific treatises, and poetry. In many ways, the thriving of Al-Andalus preceded the European Renaissance, laying a path for Europe's eventual reawakening centuries later. Despite the exceptional tolerance of the time, coexistence was sometimes tumultuous. The rulers of Córdoba consolidated power throughout Spain, Portugal, and Morocco by means of power and violence, at times directed against the Christian kingdoms remaining in Iberia. In 929 AD, Abd Al Rahman III declared the Emirate of Córdoba a caliphate, asserting its status as a true representation of the Islamic community independent from Baghdad's Abbasid dynasty. This blatant separation from Baghdad and the Abbasids in the east showed just how influential and distinct the new caliphate in Córdoba had become. It was a heartland of more than just Islam, however, and many Muslims today still hold Al-Andalus as a symbol of a lost paradise with other Jews and Christians. Its ideals have influenced the constitutions of some modern Islamic states, seeking to recreate the golden age of the Emirate and Caliphate of Córdoba. This nostalgia is shared by Jews and Christians, who see Al-Andalus as a symbol of the hope for future coexistence. The legacy of Al-Andalus continues to inspire. Modern Muslim-majority countries, such as the United Arab Emirates, have looked to Al-Andalus as a symbol of religious tolerance, cultural sophistication, and intellectual openness. This vision is expressed not only in discourse, but also through public monuments. For example, in Abu Dhabi, the capital of the UAE, the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque houses a museum exhibit dedicated to Al-Andalus. This modern tribute explores Andalusia's contributions to science, art, architecture, and interfaith dialogue. By honoring Al-Andalus within one of Islam's most iconic contemporary spaces, the UAE affirms values of coexistence and cultural heritage between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Al-Andalus remains remembered as a rare historical example of interfaith cooperation, intellectual flourishing, and urban sophistication during an age often perceived as dark and divided. Its significance is not lost in today's world, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims once again have an opportunity to set differences aside and work together for the good of each other and their communities.